You ever smelled something so bad, it crawled inside your nose and stayed there? No, I'm not talking about your uncle's rotten fridge, or that one time you forgot leftovers under your car seat. I'm talking about something worse. The kind of stink that sticks to your skin, that clings to your throat, the kind that makes your stomach churn before you even know why. The screen flickers to life. A close-up of Dan's face, staring out a rain-streaked window. His eyes are shadowed, tired. But the real focus? The reflection in the glass. A German shepherd, motionless, ribs pressing against its wet fur, eyes wide, staring into nothing. That's what Dan smelled the second he cracked open that door. And let me tell you, he wishes to hell he never did. The wind screamed through the trees, rattling branches against the log walls of the cabin like skeletal fingers trying to claw their way inside. The sky had split open hours ago, rain hammering down in thick sheets, swallowing the road leading up to Dan's place. The nearest town, 15 miles away. The nearest neighbor, dead for 6 years. Dan had chosen this solitude. After 20 years in the military, after the things he'd seen, it was better this way. No people meant no questions. No questions meant no lies. But tonight was different. Tonight there was something outside. Dan sat in his worn-out recliner, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, but the warmth didn't touch the cold crawling under his skin. Because outside, it sat there, watching. The dog. It had been there for hours. Unmoving. Just a dark, wet mass pressed against his window, its breath fogging up the glass. It didn't whimper, didn't growl, didn't blink. Dan exhaled, through his nose. Something about it was wrong. Dan wasn't a soft-hearted man. He'd seen plenty of strays before. Normally, they'd skulk around for scraps, shivering and pathetic. But this one, it didn't beg. It didn't whine. It just stared. Its fur was thick but clumped with filth, matted down with mud, blood, and God knows what else. Its ribs stretched tight against its skin, and yet it wasn't desperate. It was waiting. And Dan didn't like that one bit. His fingers tightened around his glass. No way this dog just appeared here. Someone left it here. Or worse, something scared it here. Dan swallowed, glancing at the rifle leaning against the wall. His gut twisted. That's when he heard it. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound made Dan's scalp tighten. Not the dog. It was too far from the door. Slowly, he turned his head. The doorknob twitched. A gust of wind. Maybe. His heart thudded against his ribs. His instincts, honed through years of war, screamed at him. Do not open that door. But Dan wasn't the type to cower from shadows. With a grunt, he pushed himself up, grabbing the rifle. The dog was still staring. Its ears had flattened, muscles locked tight. Dan hesitated. The air suddenly felt heavier, the kind of weight that presses down on your lungs, makes your body scream to run. Still, he moved forward. His boots thudded against the wooden floor as he approached the door, hand tightening around the knob. The scratching had stopped. That was worse. Taking a breath, Dan cracked open the door. He expected the wind, expected the rain, maybe even a raccoon skittering off into the trees. What he didn't expect was the stench. A vile, metallic rot punched him in the face, thick and wet like meat left in the sun. It coated his tongue, made his throat clench. His stomach turned, and that's when the dog moved. With a snarl, it lunged past him, bolting inside like a shot through the dark. It didn't stop until it hit the farthest corner of the room, curling in on itself. Terrified, Dan barely had time to process before a gust of wind sent something wet slapping against his cheek. He recoiled, touched his face. His fingers came away sticky. And then he saw it, just beyond the doorway. In the rain-drenched dark, something shifted. A shape. Tall. Wrong. Not human. Not animal. Something else. Dan slammed the door shut, heart hammering. He locked it, bolted it, turned. The dog was shaking violently, eyes locked on the door. And then the doorknob started turning. Without a sound. Dan had seen fear before. Real fear. The kind that settled deep in a man's bones. He'd seen it in soldiers just before a firefight, in civilians caught in the crossfire, in the mirror, on nights when the memories wouldn't let him sleep. But this was different. The German shepherd was shaking uncontrollably, even wrapped in the thickest blanket Dan could find. Its breathing was erratic, ribs rising and falling like it had just run for its life. Its eyes, those wide, frantic eyes, never left the door. Dan ran a hand down his face, swallowing the unease rising in his chest. The cabin was silent, the kind of unnatural silence that made his ears ring. Outside, the rain hammered down, but inside, even the fire had dimmed, its embers barely glowing. Dan exhaled sharply. "What the hell is wrong with you?" The dog flinched at his voice. Flinched. Dan wasn't used to things being afraid of him. He crouched beside it, watching as its ears twitched toward the door, like it was listening to something Dan couldn't hear. The dog wasn't just scared, it was waiting. Waiting for something to come inside. Dan's fingers tightened into fists. No, that was just paranoia talking. Dan needed to get his head on straight. Maybe the dog was just a stray that had been attacked. Maybe it was just reacting to whatever had been out there earlier. Maybe he was overthinking this. Yeah, that was it. Just an animal. Just bad weather. Just a freaky situation. Still, his gut told him different. He grabbed his rifle from the wall, checked the rounds, and stepped toward the door. The moment he moved, the dog whimpered. That stopped him cold. The damn thing hadn't made a sound all night. But now, as he reached for the lock, it let out a low, pleading whine, ears flattened against its skull. Dan hesitated, looked down. The dog's eyes were begging him not to go outside. His stomach twisted. But Dan had never been the type to ignore danger just because it was safer to pretend it wasn't there. With a deep breath, he unlocked the door. The wind slammed into him the second he stepped out. The cold was sharp, cutting through his flannel like knives. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky remained black as ink, clouds blotting out the moon. Dan took one step forward, then another. His boots squelched in the soaked earth, the scent of wet pine and mud filling his lungs. And then he saw it, the scratch on the door. Dan stiffened, breath catching in his throat. It was long, deep, jagged. The wood had been torn open like paper, leaving raw, splintered edges. He ran a hand over it, frowning. Too big for the dog. Too high up. Something had tried to get in. Or worse, something had been dragged out. Dan's eyes flicked to the ground, and his blood ran cold. Footprints. Barefoot. Human. But wrong. The prints were too deep, like whoever made them had been heavy. And the spacing too far apart. Too unnatural. Dan followed them with his flashlight, stomach twisting tighter with every step. The prints led away from the cabin, toward the tree line. Something gnawed at the back of his mind. Something that didn't fit. Then it hit him. No toe marks. A barefoot print should have had clear toe imprints. These didn't. Like whoever left them had claws instead. Dan swallowed hard. He should go back inside. But he didn't. Instead, he followed. The woods were a living thing at night. The trees groaned in the wind, their branches clawing at the sky. Shadows twisted between the trunks, shifting like something was moving just out of sight. Dan's grip on his rifle tightened. He stepped deeper, the mud sucking at his boots. A ripped piece of fabric fluttered from a low-hanging branch, soaked through and stained dark. Dan pulled it free. A sleeve. He took a breath, scanned the ground, and found a boot. Just one. Torn at the heel, half buried in the mud. Dan crouched, running his fingers over the edge. Still warm. Someone had lost it recently. His heart slammed against his ribs. Then, his flashlight flickered over something metallic. A cell phone. Shattered, but still on. Dan hesitated before picking it up. The screen was cracked, but still glowing faintly. A text message was typed out. Unsent. Dan's stomach coiled as he read it. It's following me. If you find this, don't. The message cut off. Dan felt his pulse hammering in his throat. Then, a sound. A low, guttural growl. Directly behind him. Dan went dead still. The growl wasn't from a dog. It wasn't human. It was low, wet, and vibrating with something primal, something hungry. Slowly, he turned his head. At first, he saw nothing. Just trees. Just darkness. But then 2 glowing eyes blinked open. Far too high up. Far too wide apart. A shape unfurled from the shadows. Tall. Wrong. It had been watching him the whole time. Dan's breath hitched. Then, it moved. Dan had faced gunfire, explosions, ambushes. He had seen men reduced to nothing but red mist and echoes of their last breath. But this was something else. The thing in the woods moved. Not with a lurch. Not with a step. It glided. The darkness around it seemed to bend, like the trees themselves recoiled from its presence. The glow of its eyes burned into his skull, locking him in place. Dan didn't wait, didn't think, didn't breathe. He ran. The forest blurred around him, shadows twisting as his boots pounded the mud-soaked ground. Behind him, a sound, a low, wet clicking, like something unhinging its jaw. Dan pushed harder, his lungs screaming. The cabin came into view, the faint flicker of firelight through the window a beacon of safety, a lie, but the only one he had. As he neared the porch, a loud snarl erupted from inside. The dog, barking like hell itself, was knocking at the door. Dan leapt onto the steps, yanked the handle locked. Damn it! He fumbled for his keys, hands shaking. Behind him, the tree shifted. The thing was closer. Too close. It had let him run. Dan's fingers found the key, twisted it. The door slammed open, and Dan threw himself inside. The dog lunged forward, snapping at the air as if trying to bite something just behind him. Dan spun, kicking the door shut and shoving every lock into place. Silence. Just the crackling of the fire. Just his ragged breathing. Just the dog, now pressing itself against the door, whining. Dan gripped his knees, sweat slicking his face despite the cold. This wasn't just paranoia. This wasn't just a stray dog showing up on his doorstep. Something was out there, and it wanted in. Dan grabbed his rifle from the table, his hand steadying as instinct took over. Years of training, of muscle memory, pushing back the terror clawing at his throat. He exhaled, checked the rounds. Loaded. Ready. The dog growled. Low. Quiet. A sound that belonged in a throat full of blood. Dan followed its gaze to the window. A shadow moved. A shape long, stretched too tall for the porch. Dan's grip tightened. He flicked on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the glass. Scratch. Dan's stomach dropped. For deep, gashing marks now ran down the window pane. Not just marks. Claw marks. Dan backed away, rifle raised. The dog whimpered, shaking again. Then, the lights flickered. A dull hum filled the air, vibrating through the floorboards. Then, total blackness. The fire snuffed out. The cabin drowned in absolute silence. Not even the wind howled anymore. Dan swallowed, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could hear the dog's panic breathing. And then, the sound that shattered everything. The front door handle turned. Slow. Deliberate. A metallic click-click-click, as if testing the lock. Dan's breath stopped. His body locked in place, muscles screaming to move, to react, to do something. But there were no footsteps. Nothing leading up to the door. Just the handle turning. Dan forced himself to move, raising the rifle. The dog. The dog lunged at him. The shepherd snapped onto Dan's arm, teeth digging in. Not hard enough to break skin, but enough to pull. Dan nearly fired out of reflex. Jesus! He snarled, wrenching free. The dog didn't flinch. It grabbed onto his sleeve, pulling, dragging him away from the door. Dan's back hit the wall. The dog was freaking out, its tail between its legs, its entire body coiled, like a spring ready to snap. It wasn't attacking him. It was saving him. And then, the door creaked. Dan's chest heaved as the door bulged inward, like something heavy was pressing against it. The handle rattled harder now. More desperate. More frantic. The wood groaned, the hinges creaking. Dan aimed his rifle, finger on the trigger. But he didn't fire. Something inside him, some deep, primal instinct, screamed not to. Not yet. His flashlight still hung from his belt. Dan reached for it, slowly, flicked it on. A thin, trembling beam of light spilled under the door, and in that tiny gap, Dan saw it. A foot. Human, but not. The skin was stretched too tight, grayish, wet, as if it had been left in the rain too long. The nails, black, jagged, digging into the floor. The leg twitched, shuddered, like it didn't quite know how to move. Dan felt his throat go dry. And then, the breathing, low, deep, behind the door. And then, a whisper, not a voice, not words, just something pretending to be human, something trying to sound like it belonged. A hollow, gurgling sound that almost resembled laughter. Dan's finger twitched on the trigger, but before he could fire, the thing at the door stopped. No footsteps, no retreating, just gone. The dog whimpered, and then 3 sharp knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Dan stepped back. His breath came sharp, his pulse hammering like war drums in his ears. The dog, this damn dog, was still pulling at him, its teeth locked around his sleeve, its entire body straining, as if the only thing that mattered was getting him away from that door. Dan listened. Finally, he took another step back, and just like that, the handle stopped turning. The cabin fell silent. Not just quiet, dead. Even the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. No wind, no rain, no creaking trees. Nothing. Dan swallowed, rifle still raised, finger barely a twitch away from the trigger. Then, thud. Not at the door. Behind him. Dan froze. The dog spun, its head snapping toward the hallway. Its ears flattened, its tail tucked so tight it was nearly beneath its belly. Dan turned slowly, his stomach twisting into knots. His flashlight. He needed his flashlight. He reached down, fingers fumbling at his belt, hands shaking. He clicked it on. A thin, trembling beam of light sliced through the hallway. Empty. At first, Dan took a step forward. The floorboard beneath his boot let out a faint creak. And then, a sound. Running. Inside. Fast. Too fast. Thud, 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 thud. Dan's body locked up, his breath catching in his throat. Something wasn't right. The sound wasn't coming toward him. It was circling. Around the cabin. Inside the walls. The dog let out a low, pitiful whine. And then, the light flickered. For a single second. And in that second, Dan saw it. At the end of the hall. Just standing there. Not moving. Not breathing. Just watching. Dan's entire body went rigid. The flashlight shook in his grip. The beam of light barely steady as it illuminated the gaunt, impossibly tall figure. It was human-shaped, but only in the sense that a scarecrow resembled a man. Its limbs were too long. Its skin hung in loose, wet folds. And its head. Dan's stomach flipped. Its head tilted. A slow, unnatural motion. Like it wasn't sure how a neck was supposed to work. Empty, hollow eyes locked onto his. Dan couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't. The thing lunged. Dan fired. A single shot boom. Roaring through the cabin, shaking the walls. The flashlight dropped from his hands, the beam rolling wildly across the floor as he stumbled back. The dog barked, snarled, snapped its teeth. Dan scrambled, grabbing the rifle with both hands, heart slamming against his ribs. The hallway was empty. Nothing there. But the air was wrong. It felt heavy, thick like a swamp in July, like he was breathing something that didn't belong in this world. The dog let out a shrill, ear-piercing yelp. Dan snapped his head toward it, and the back door exploded inward. Dan didn't think, didn't hesitate. He just ran. The dog bolted past him, paws skidding across the floor as it shot toward the tree-line. Dan followed, his boots slamming against the mud as he threw himself into the storm. The wind shrieked, rain slashing at his face. Behind him, the cabin door burst open. Dan didn't look back, didn't need to, because the sound that followed him, that twisted, choking gurgle, half animal, half something else, was wrong. So violently, unnaturally wrong. The dog yelped, skidding to a stop, doubling back toward him. Dan's legs burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel it. That thing. Gaining on him. Getting closer. His truck. He just had to make it to his damn truck. Dan pushed harder, forcing his legs to move faster, every step a battle against the mud sucking at his boots. The dog was already there, jumping against the door, barking wildly. Dan fumbled for his keys, hands shaking, chest heaving. Behind him, the trees bent backward, like something huge was moving through them. Crack! Snap! Thud! Dan's fingers found the key. He shoved it in the lock. The truck door flew open. The dog leapt inside. Dan threw himself in after it, yanking the door shut just as something slammed into the side of the truck. The entire vehicle shook. Dan jammed the key into the ignition, turned it. The engine sputtered. Died. No. No, 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 no. He tried again. The engine roared to life. Dan slammed the gas. The tires spun in the mud, screeched. And then they were moving. Dan's breath came in sharp gasps. His arms ached from gripping the wheel too tight. The dog was curled up on the passenger seat, still shaking. Dan swallowed hard, sweat cooling against his skin. His hands were still trembling. His entire body was screaming at him to keep driving. Keep moving. Don't stop. Don't think. But his eyes, his goddamn eyes, went to the rearview mirror, and he saw them. The eyes. Two distant, glowing orbs, watching from the tree-line. Unblinking, unmoving, waiting. Dan clenched his jaw. He gripped the wheel tighter, and he didn't look back. The highway stretched ahead, empty and endless. Dan finally exhaled. The dog shifted, curling tighter against the seat. Dan glanced at it, at the way its body had finally stopped shaking, at the way it looked at him, calm now, like it had done its job, like it had always known. Dan swallowed, ran a hand down his face. You knew, he muttered. The dog didn't move, didn't bark, didn't even lift its head, just let out a slow, exhausted sigh. Dan turned his eyes back to the road and kept driving, not looking back, not ever looking back.